First of all, for all those I now can't see, really warm welcome to you all. It's great to see you all again, especially after these long times. Just to fill you in what's going to happen, though we're going for a virtual AGM this year, we're definitely going to be having a spring meeting next year. So hopefully I'll be meeting people in person. But also for future events, if this works, we're looking at doing probably a hybrid, because we know people from other parts of the county often find it difficult to get to indoor meetings. So we'd really like some feedback. If you think that's a good idea, trying to do both a virtual and an in-person meeting at the same time. So please let us know that. As you've seen, Steve's managing the process. And the important thing to not only realise, but also if you can make a firm note, if anything goes wrong today, it's all Steve's fault, nothing to do with me. Sorry about that, Steve. I've been asked to just make sure there's some Zoom etiquette we're using. I think when I last saw the screen, you'd all gone to mute, but if you can go to mute, that'd be great. If you've got any questions that arise, please type them in as normal, and either if Steve can answer them, he'll answer them as we're going along. Otherwise, we'll do that in the Q&A session at the end. As you've seen, the meeting's being recorded. And the meeting will be available on our website when we're finished as well. And Steve made a note here, please don't share your personal details via Zoom to the whole group. And if you're invited to speak when we have the Q&A, then please just unmute and ask your question, and we'll go from there. Hopefully you've all received the newsletter, but really the agenda for today is we're going to do the normal AGM stuff, followed by my review, the Treasurer's report, Digital Officer's report, the Butterfly Recorder's report, and then my conservation report. And then we're going to look at two moth reports from Alan Pryor and David Brown. We're going to have a short break, and then we get on to the talks. And I'm really looking forward to Jamie Wildman doing his updates on the checkered skipper, having seen his first report some time ago, I think mid-year. And then we've got a talk by Steve on his visit to Lake Kirkini, Northern Greece. I hope I've said that right.
Close.
Yeah. Right, so just the formal business we've just got to do. In the newsletter you received, we had various people up for re-election of the committee. In 2020, we had David Brown, Debbie Cheshire, Steve Cheshire and Steve Wright. In 2001, we had Phil Parr, Richard Lamb, Sue Walker and myself. During that time, we also co-opted Katie Thorpe and Kaz Bailey to our committee in February 2020 and March 2021, respectively. And I've received so far from the newsletter Hugh Woodland, who works for the School of Life Sciences at Warwick University, has offered to come on the committee. So all those people, because I've received no objections, been accepted on the committee. Anyone else wanted to join the committee, you still have time, so please contact me in the near future. So now we're going to move on to next slide, please, Steve. Hopefully it's membership. Right, the first thing I'd like to say is, most of you probably are unaware of this, but we've had huge problems this year with the membership system. BC Nationally brought in a new computer. And the short answer is it didn't work very well. So last time I saw Debbie, she still had some hair left, but I'm sure most of it's been pulled out. She's spent hours and hours and hours trying to sort out our membership data. And finally, and it was finally after a lot of chivying by all sorts of people, just the other week, we managed to get, we think is the accurate number of members we've got, which is 589, which actually, like most of the branches, shows a slight reduction in overall memberships. So official figures are we gained 32 members and we lost, compared to 86 last year, and we lost 44 members compared to 55 in 2020. The other things I should mention is Only 65 of our members now receive hard copy communication from the branch. 88% actually have it electronically. Now, we've all heard of the climate crisis, and we've had a branch chairs meeting, or a couple of branch chairs meetings during this time. And the whole idea is we're looking to move to a net zero in butterfly conservation nationally. And one of the things I know that we're looking at is how we can go more to electronic rather than paper copies of things. So that's, I'll watch this space really. Next slide, please, Steve. Despite COVID and having to cancel the events early in the year, we did manage to do a number of guided walks. First one was at Yosin Bank, which actually is, if you ever think about going out on your own, is an excellent site for Adonis and Chalkhill Blue. And then we did a guided walk at Walford Wood, and then went on to Witchford Wood. And then we've also done one at Exton Cutting. And again, hope I don't upset anybody, but we had a great walk around Walford Wood, saw lots of silver wash fritillaries and white admirals. And then I went back the following week, parked in their car park there, and within a metre of me had 5 male purple emperors surrounding me. Great view, but unfortunately I was the only one that saw it. So apologies for that. We've also done the moth nights. David did moth nights in the normal way, but a much reduced one due to COVID. Next one, please. These are, well, they're largely firmed up. These are the events we've got planned for 2022. They are on our website, and I don't anticipate they're going to change much. And interestingly enough, we've now got a very good relationship going with the North Hants and Bedford branch. So you can see there on the 19th of June, there's a guided walk for the Black Hare Streak at 3 different venues. So we know parking at some of these venues is a bit difficult. So people can pick their own venue, and North Hants people are going to actually show you their reserves and Black Hare Streak there. To return a favour later on in the year on one of our events at Wrightwood Meadows, I'm going to do one on Brown Hare Street, which the branch hasn't got in North Hants. And next one, please.
Yeah. So that's the second set of events for 2022 going up to September. So over to you, Keith.
Okay, we'll dive straight into the financial report. Just a reminder that from the 1st of April 2020, our branch bank account was closed together with all other branches and consolidated into the main Butterfly Conservation head office account. Now, we're assured that this won't change anything that we decide in terms of what we decide to allocate funds-wise at branch level. And we receive a monthly management account posted on branch SharePoint, albeit somewhat sporadically, which details income and expenditure for the branch. All branch expenditure and volunteer expenses are approved by at least 2 of 3 nominated committee members, myself, Mike and Debbie, before submission to BC Finance. And all income will be credited to the branch, provided that it's referenced with the letters WA. So if people are making donations to the branch via BACS or even check, they must reference this WA to be sure that it will come into our allocation of money. And we still retain a petty cash account up to approximately £200. Next slide, please, Steve. So here's a very high level statement of income and expenditure from the last audited branch accounts. And considering that no funds were raised from meetings due to COVID restrictions for most of that financial year, the general branch income was surprisingly good. But of course, with the same restrictions, we didn't actually have that much expenditure, because obviously meetings and things that we would normally pay for didn't take place. Regarding the opening balance of the Wrighton Wood restricted fund, there are ongoing talks with finance concerning this high opening balance, because it appears that, to quote BC Finance, there may be some discrepancies on the allocation of income or expenditure between these funds and the branch's general fund. In other words, some of that allocation to Wrighton, I think, has probably come out of our general fund, but it's something that makes very little difference to us, and we will be sorting out. But overall, the funds that were carried over into the current financial year have left us in quite a healthy position. Next slide, please, Steve. Just a closer look at the branch income shows that once again, we're totally reliant on our members through their subscriptions and generous donations. We're particularly grateful to Richard's Guitars in Stratford, who have a range of guitar accessories, the sale of which contributed a donation to the branch, which is quite a good one. The management agreement that's there for the Newton Cutting Reserve is not really income. It just they cover BC Warwickshire's volunteer expenses as we do the conservation work on the site. Next slide, Steve, please. After the obligatory expenses incurred through servicing the membership with various things, magazines, etc., we're still able to contribute to conservation from branch funds through the supply of seeds and plants and equipment to sites other than to Wrighton, which obviously the restricted fund covers. Next slide, please. And the restricted fund income is pretty much solely from the from annual payments under the Environmental Stewardship Scheme. Although there are big changes, obviously, you're probably aware of, in terms of these schemes going forward. It's likely that this restricted fund will be wholly managed by BC head office, and when I say we, Mike, will submit a budget for the reserve to them at the beginning of each year, because they currently pool the Rural Payments Agency payments and allocate resources across all of their reserves. Next slide, please. Bringing us up to date, this is the total branch funds as at the 31st of October this year, and also the value of legacy from Phil Payne, which continues to creep upwards. And this will be used to produce our book on practical butterfly conservation. Next slide. And finally, our future budget contains all the usual suspects that you see every time we have an AGM, but we do kind of edge ever closer to fulfilling some of these aspirations. Thank you very much. That's all for now on that one.
Okay, so I'll just do a very quick update on the general sort of comms for the website. So Katie Thorpe generally does the social media for the branch. So just an update really on the followers. On Twitter, we've got 2,334 followers, and with Facebook, 212 likes, 246 followers. Obviously, if there's anybody out there who uses Facebook or Twitter or any of the social media channels, if you could promote the branch's Twitter accounts and Facebook pages, that would be fantastic, and share some of the content. Also, if there's anybody out there who'd like to get involved with doing some of the social media as well, that would be brilliant, because I'm sure Katie would be very pleased with the help. So do get in touch. And then just wanted to give you a quick overview of the branch website and how it's sort of progressed, especially during lockdown. It just gives you a bit of an idea of the things that were going on over the last couple of years, really. So you can see here, 2021, there's a bit of an anomaly on the, oops, how do I go back? 1 second. I might have to. There we go. There's a bit of an anomaly there on Thursday, the 12th of August. I'm not quite sure what that was. But you can generally see that obviously July June, July, August, it tends to be the peak times for the website because a lot of people are submitting records online. So this graph here really just shows the difference between 2020 and 2021, and you can see the peak in the yellow chart here was pretty much in the sort of lockdown period in 2020 when people were able to get out but couldn't really socialize. So a lot of people were going out submitting records around them. So that sort of clearly illustrates that. So the orange line is 2020, the blue 2021. And generally the site continues to get new visitors, more site visitors, more sessions each visit. But what is tending to happen is the number of pages that are being visited and the time that people spend on the website is starting to go down. That's often a general shift between people now are often using social media a bit more often for content and that type of thing. So people sort of time that they spend on websites is diminishing slowly, and we're sort of seeing that. But I think that's also reflected in the fact that our website's looking a little bit dated, and perhaps we need to update some of the content. So that just gives you an idea of how things have grown and changed. So having 11,886 users just in 2021 is quite an amazing number of visits. And again, this is just a sort of spread from 2017 to 2021 chart that just shows how we are increasing the visitor numbers. So 2017, you can see the visitor numbers increased a reasonable amount during the summer months, and into 2018 is quite a clear increase. 2019, we've got that red bar there that just shows where the website was down, where it was the time between the new website and the online recording system being updated. So that's why there's no data then, but you can see there was a very quick uptake on that once the website was back up and running. And then 2020, 2021, we've had some really, really good numbers of visits to the website. So there's a massive increase in interest clearly in the interest of butterflies and moths over the last couple of years. And it seems to be partly to do with lockdown. So what I'm currently working on at the moment is an update to the website, which will have a slightly more streamlined appearance to it, but it'll also be updated to various updates. So I'm updating it to HTML5, more compact navigation, updating the code so it's a bit more secure, because Keith and myself, Keith primarily verifies all the records submitted to the website. They're all checked and all manually verified. And occasionally we have a lot of sort of spam and sort of hacked submissions, which become a real pain sometimes and can cause problems with the database. So with this update in the code, hopefully that'll improve security. With that, it is likely that we're going to require a gatekeeper login. So this is where you have to log in to submit your records rather than just a form where you just fill in the form, submit. This will be that you have to log in first in order to do that. Once you've set up a gatekeeper account though, your browser should remember your login, so it should be quite easy to log back in quickly. And again, this is to reduce the number of spam records that Keith particularly has to deal with when he's verifying records. Because especially in the summer months when you may have, I don't know, Keith, possibly a couple of hundred records to verify in a week. If you then find another 100 spam records you've got to delete, it becomes a real pain. So it just helps streamline that side of things. We're also going to improve the grid reference generator. You'll all notice at the moment the Google map for submitting records doesn't work, so you can't generate a grid reference. We're aware of that. So hopefully we're going to go to a new system which will allow us to generate grid references. And then there will also be some additional features, including flight charts based on the real site data. So rather than the generic flight charts that we've got on the species pages at the moment, it will actually use all of the data that's been submitted since 2017, held in the online database, to generate the flight chart. So it's based on real data. So that'll be a big change. and just generally reviewing and updating the content. So if anybody's got any suggestions, any content that they think that we should add to the website, do get in touch. Really keen to get any suggestions. If anybody thinks there's certain things that need fixing or wrong or updating, do let me know, and I can add those ready for the launch of the new website early in the new year. So that's my update for the comms. So I'll hand back to Keith now for the butterfly report.
Thanks very much, Steve. Yeah, next slide. It's that slide you all hate. It's my usual plea for any outstanding butterfly records from 2021. The sooner all the data is submitted, obviously, the sooner the necessary analysis can be done, which gets fed back to landowners and managers. And the sooner we can identify the recording targets and any gaps in our 5-year recording cycle for 2022. Next slide. So looking at the transects, when I last looked at the data, we got 77 of our 81 transects had been data had been received from, something like 46,000, over 46,000 butterflies recorded. I'm aware of a couple of transects that weren't carried out, and I think there's a couple of sets of data that I'm still waiting for. But otherwise, it's a pretty good return. Just people just scraping in before the end of November. And a new transect was walked in 2021, which was at Luddington Nature Reserve near Stratford. This was primarily to monitor the progress of the site, which is particularly the grassland areas there, which, with the help of Mike's team from BC Warwickshire, is being improved for butterflies such as small blue, dingy skipper, and grizzled skipper. I also want to take this opportunity to appeal for butterfly recorders who can monitor those 3 sites. Now, those Wappenbury Wood, Snitterfield Bushes, and Oversley Wood are pretty important woodland sites in the county, and we're losing our recorder for Wappenbury, and Snitterfield Bushes and Oversley has only historically been recorded on a species transect, and the gentleman who's didn't manage to do it at all this year. He's involved with barn owls and other things. So really we could do with some more regular recording on those sites. So if anybody thinks they can help with that, and if you can't do a full 26-week transect, then some of the lesser surveys can be attempted through monthly visits or whatever. But any records from there on a regular basis would be useful. And please contact me after the meeting at some stage if you think you can help with those 3 sites. Next slide, Steve, thanks. So looking at the top performing species again, the 4 top recorded species across the transect data, and once again the grassland species top the list with, as you can see from the records, the meadow brown eclipsing the rest with twice as many records as its nearest rival, the ringlet. And this top 4 matches the species from 2019. Can't really compare easily with the 2020 records transect wise, because COVID interrupted the recording with people not able to get out to the transects for most of the beginning of the year. So the actual transect data for this year hasn't been fully analysed yet, and we'll know a bit more when it is, and we'll be reporting on the performance of each species by the spring meeting, and probably in the spring newsletter. Next slide, please. This is the top 4 species from the web records, and it's a similar picture. 44,842 butterflies were recorded on our website in 2021, which is pretty amazing. But as you can see, the small tortoiseshell sneaks into the top 4, and I think that's mainly because the general recording has a bit of a bias towards gardens and the more urban areas, so more likely to pick up records of small tortoiseshell. And it's interesting that the small tortoiseshell actually outnumbered peacock records by about 50% in the general recordings, which people may have felt the same sort of thing. Next slide, please. An interesting sort of COVID-related phenomenon I spotted looking through the records, comparing the years, comparing which species were found in the most tetrads in 2020 and 2021. The peacock was the widest distributed species in 2020, when people were forced to stay local and mostly recorded in towns, villages, and gardens. But in 2021, once the people were able to get out and about, the orange tip became the most widely recorded species, and especially with recorders like Mike, who were unleashed into the wider countryside. Next slide, please. And you can see this quite remarkably in the maps for with the concentration of dots for all the species, clearly reflecting in the recorders were unable to stray far from home in 2020, whereas all those little yellow dots in 2021 clearly show that mostly Mike, but others managed to seize the opportunity to go square bashing, and particularly for orange tip adults, eggs and caterpillars across the south of the county, which is why most of those yellow dots, 1 to 9 species, will probably be orange tip records. But it is quite noticeable how we managed to get across the county a bit more this year. Next slide, please. So just to see how our key Warwickshire species performed in 2021, I've compared the number of web records in 2021 with a 3-year mean and chosen 4 species that have shown significant decrease or remain stable or have shown significant increase. Totally unscientific, but borne out by my own impressions when butterflying locally. And many recorders reported 2021 as a strange year, and perhaps not the year that was expected after 2020's bumper recording year. It's also noticeable that some variation in numbers of species were quite sort of site specific. But certainly the poor spring weather influenced dingy, skipper, brown argus and small copper numbers. And the small copper, I don't think, fared particularly much better in the second brood either. Sadly, the poor old wood white fell foul of some, let's say, unsympathetic management work at its stronghold in Wrighton Wood, and unfortunately had a disastrous year. So those are the 4 that showed the significant decreases. Or you could also add, I think, to that Essex skipper, comma, peacock, and red admiral all showed a decrease when compared with the 3-year mean. Next slide, please. On the plus side, the 4 of our rarest butterflies in Warwickshire remain stable, pretty much in terms of the figures, although they didn't quite perform as well as they did in 2020. Certainly against the 3-year mean, they're pretty stable. So that's good news. And also, of course, our conservation effort. A lot of our conservation effort is aimed at these species in particular. So that's a reasonably good sign. Next slide, please. And these are the species that I think did pretty well. Apart from the green hair streak, or the sightings of the rest of the hair streaks had increased considerably, I would say. And I'd like to think it's perhaps through our constant reminder to recorders to check the tree canopies for purple hair streak and white letter hair streak that we're seeing so many records of what were, I think, previously overlooked in a lot of cases. Purple emperor records have also increased significantly since 2019. And I think a lot of these high numbers are no doubt due to the increased enthusiasm of our membership in seeking out grounded males in Oversley Wood, judging by the amount of grounded male photographs that have appeared on various social media. So the hair streaks have done very well. Next slide, please. So much so that I would say that the brown hair streak is definitely my butterfly of the year. There's more adult sightings than ever, and as you can see, there was even a maximum of 20 counted by one of our members who camped out early morning and watched the brown hare streaks coming out of the ash tree in the corner of the reserve at Ryton Wood Meadows in September. And 9 adults were recorded on transects on across 3 different transects. In actual fact, Bubbenhall Meadow, Ryton Wood Meadow, and Ryton Pool Country Park. So that was pretty much unprecedented as well. And again, some amazing photographs from our reserve of brown hare streak adults this year. A lot of our members saw them and took some great photographs. So once again, a fuller report on how these species have fared in 2021 will be in our branch magazine, which will be published in the spring. That's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, over to you, Mike, for the conservation report.
Okay, next slide then, please. Well, first thing I'd like to say is it's exciting times out there. I'm getting the impression from visiting lots and lots of landowners and just the general public that we may have turned the corner. Lots of people want to do things to help our butterflies. And despite COVID, I've visited an amazing 36 site visits this year, virtually one nearly every week to give advice on how to improve areas. But more importantly than that, some of them are really key players. Visited 6 farms, which all of them are over 1,000 acres in size. And there's one farm that is currently very intensively farmed near Stoneleigh. But because of negotiations, what they're looking to do is managing, we haven't sort of measured how much hedgerow they've got, but they've got a considerable amount purely for the brown hare streak. So we know what to do, and you've seen that work we've done at Ryton, where we're just looking after 30 acres. If he's doing that for 1,000 acres at Stoneleigh, you can imagine the difference that will make to species like that. But all those, I'm not going to go through them all on that slide. Lots and lots of people want to do lots and lots of things for butterflies and moths in Warwickshire. And the other exciting thing is that one of the farmers we visited, as opposed to being an intensive sheep farm, is now going on to producing wildflower seed on a mass production. And that seed is going to be used locally. So now one of my main jobs is going around to places, finding out who wants to create a new wildflower meadow. And I've lost count, actually. I didn't manage to count them all up, how many new meadows we're going to get in Warwickshire, where we've all heard about all these declines. But more than that, that because of the way that farm is now going to be working with Warwickshire County Council Ecologist Department and the way they administer biodiversity offsetting, we should really be able to get at an awful lot of sites some real big biodiversity gains in the near future. I feel it's like a snowball rolling down a hill. It's getting bigger and bigger. Next slide, please. And this should just give some of the flavours of the different meetings I've gone to on your behalf. It's enthusing me that the way the BC are going. I was involved in there as a member on their strategy meeting before this new strategy was all done. And we've also had 2 branch chairs meetings during the last 12 months. And if I say that they're ambitious, hopefully you've all seen the new strategy, but I think the key thing is for me, they're looking to make 100,000 new wildlife sites in the next 5 years by basically doing similar things to we do in Warwickshire. And certainly I've signed up on our behalf to actually help in that process. But other things that's interesting is that people like the Heart of England Forest now are really going down this route of not only planting trees as their main aim is to be, but they're looking to improve all their grasslands. And eventually this Heart of England Forest will be 30,000 acres, mainly in Warwickshire, but also in Worcestershire and a little bit in Gloucestershire. And they're doing specific things to things like the Purple Emperor and the White Letter Hare Streak. So just anecdotally, a couple of people and members of the public were talking. They were driving through some of the areas of Hardingham Forest, and really annoyingly, they had to stop their car and wipe their screen at night because of all the insects that were hitting their screen. And that led us into a conversation that I can remember with my father 50 odd years ago, driving down country lanes, and he had to stop his car every so often to wipe the screen clean. So perhaps finally we're turning the tide of conservation and getting some of our wildlife back in Warwickshire. Thank you. Next slide. It's very controversial, but one of the biggest for me at the moment. Recently, I've given 2 talks to the HS2 ecologists, one that runs from basically Southam to Birmingham, and this week also from Southam all the way down to London, about how they can create and manage the embankments of HS2 for butterflies. And I've got to say, I gave a talk this Thursday, and to talk about enthusiasm, these people were really enthusiastic because obviously they've had a lot of flack for the stuff they've done. But I was showing them what they can do with their embankments. And in fact, one of the ecologists is actually a BC member and a mother that wants to do more for certain moths. So again, I know it's controversial, but those who drive down the M40 and have seen some of the embankments down the M40, if they can do something similar on HS2 embankments, that would be good. They've also got actual designed compensation areas. And I visited one near Southam at Stoneleigh Abbey there, not Stoneleigh Abbey, Stonythorpe Abbey. And at the moment, I'd give them a 6 out of 10 for what they've done. And that's all to do with they didn't get the right advice when they were making this area. But again, talking to the ecologists, I think they're going to go for a few tweaks that could make a lot of these areas suitable, things like small blue, grizzle skipper and dingy skipper. They're certainly going to start planting goat willow and older buckthorn for the purple emperor and brimstone, and also witch elm for the white-legged hare streak. So again, because of the scale of HS2, we could actually get a lot of the biodiversity back. And they were saying they do want to get a net gain, bear in mind of the damage they've done, where they've been, and they're looking for where they can do that, and they want to work with us very closely. So in addition to that, as usual, I've done some transect training for the Hardingham Forest, because again, they've got the gold standard for how they acquire land, they set up proper monitoring, and then they monitor it and actually act on anything that's going wrong. I wish other landowners and other so-called conservation groups could possibly do the same. Other guided walks. Now, I'll put these up because, again, I've done these walks for other people in addition to what we do as a branch. Now, it is possible often for our own branch members to actually go on these walks as well if they wanted to. But there may be a charge or some negotiation. But if they look carefully and they want to go somewhere, then they contact me. At least I can facilitate them with, say, going to Heart of England walk or whatever, and get them to sign on to that. Thank you. Next slide. In addition to this, we did the normal Rightwood transect and management reports, which goes off to the Centre in Natural England, just showing how our management is done at Righton and how we monitor it and act on any monitoring information we get. And interestingly, we did a report that went in Hare Street magazine, and Keith's already done it, but just to give you an update on the book. It's been written, it's been proofread, it's been formatted, and we're currently now at the last stage of sort of putting the photographs in and then doing the final checks. And Dan Hall from Butterfly Conservation is going to do the forward. He's actually got an electronic copy of all the words at the moment, and he's hopefully going to read it over the next period. So keep looking at Keith, but hopefully it'll be out very soon next year. Next one, please. Now, working with COVID has been interesting and challenging. I know a lot of organisations actually stopped doing conservation during these periods. But what we did was we actually worked in smaller groups, and we've got very, very knowledgeable and proficient volunteers in butterfly conservation Warwickshire, which we're very grateful for. And some like doing seeding, some like doing chainsawing, some like doing brush cutting, etc., etc. And it's a matter of actually getting them to the right place with the right equipment to actually carry out work. And what this has meant last year, actually, if you look at the amount of work parties we did last year, we did a phenomenal 207 work parties. That's basically 4 a week. And we did that on 24 sites, conserving our butterflies and moths and their environment. And that's by just jiggling the volunteers around and getting things done. And because of our monitoring that Keith's already talked about, we know this is working. And so if anyone wants to get involved and come help join the team, please contact me. But even if you think, well, I couldn't wield a rake, doing raking, because what we're also looking for, and hopefully you've seen this in the newsletter, is because wildflower seed is becoming terrifically expensive and we're losing some of our funding for Wrightonwood Meadows, I'm actually looking for our members to step up and collect seed for us, so we can actually make all these sites we work on better by making them more biodiverse. So if anyone's interested in collecting seed for us, again, contact me and we can give you bespoke instructions of what to collect, where and how. Next slide, please. Now, this is very, very interesting. As Keith said, we've only done some real quick, dirty analysis so far. But I always, when I finish the year, look at Wrighton to see how it's done. And we've monitored on the main Wrightonwood transect there for 32 years. And despite we're having a poor spring, despite it being a bit of a funny year, and it's going to be strange to analyse it, we overall, on that particular transect, after 32 years, we had the 4th best year for overall numbers of butterflies. And that's phenomenal. And it's got to be down to some of the management we do there. So we know what we're doing is working. And even on the 2 which were originally species transects, it's now full transects, they had actually their 2nd best year in the years they've been done. To give you some comparison to other transects I've looked at so far, unfortunately, we know Wrightonwood's got problems, but the 4 transects that's done there, in the 32 years that's been monitored, they actually had their worst year in 32 for overall butterflies. And that goes on with some of the other things they're doing, which isn't helping rare butterflies. But generally, other sites like Fenny, Compton, Southern Bypass, and 1 or 2 others I've looked at, it's going to be different around the county because of different weather conditions. But I'm guessing it's going to be a fairly average year overall for butterflies, which even so makes the performance at Wrightonwood Meadows very, very rewarding. And so, yeah, just going to keep doing what we do, and hopefully we'll keep having some more years like this. Next slide, please. Yeah, just to give you an idea, again, it's an absolute phenomenal amount, especially compared to some of our other branches. We did, 5,291.5 hours of practical volunteer work. That was slightly down in hours, but actually in days, it was actually slightly up. So again, despite COVID, we not only managed to make sure all our sites were managed correctly according to the management plan, work plan I've devised for them, but actually, all our sites that we manage, the main 11, are really doing well and actually are improving. And the other 20 odd, they're also improving. So yeah, the more volunteers we get, the more we'll do, and the more we will improve these sites for butterflies. And if you want to know what's going on often a day-by-day basis, Steve's mentioned the branch websites and social media. But everything we do, or I do on my work parties, if you follow me on Mike Slater 5, you'll see exactly what's happening, and also other stuff we do, from not just the practical work parties, but what's the result of visiting various landowners and other stuff. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Has anybody got any questions at all? Doesn't look like it.
I'll say, Steve,
No.
I see something in the chat room. Is that you've already answered those?
Yeah, I've already answered that. It was just one of those figures on one of your tables, Mike, that I was supposed to fix and didn't. It said 245 butterflies on your butterfly bank, and it should have been 24.
I was going to step in. I was going to step in and cough to that, so that'll be my fault. There's got a stray 5 got in there somewhere.
Okay, so no other questions. Okay, bro. What we'll do then, we'll go on to David Brown's moth report. David isn't with us at the moment. He's not attending the meeting, but what he has done instead is he sent us a video of his moth report. So I will play that to you now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to give a short talk on the more notable species of moth caught during 2021 in Warwickshire. In June of 2021, Atropus, the national magazine for Lepidoptera, had a special edition, and in that edition, I wrote a comprehensive article on Warwickshire moths, highlighting the many changes that have occurred in 25 years, bringing everybody up to date on the Warwickshire moth. Somebody said to me that if you do that sort of article, you know what's going to happen. And I thought, I know what you mean. And incredibly, in 2021, we had 4 new species of macro moth recorded, which is equaling the record years of 2006 and 2017, when 4 species were recorded in those years. So in a way, this article I wrote became quickly out of date. And the first new species to be recorded shortly after that article was the bilberry pug at Rough Hill Wood on the 24th of June by Martin Kennard. Bilberry pug is a species which, as its name implies, is exclusive feeder on bilberry, and it's difficult to know whether the population would be a relic population at Rough Hill Wood or a new introduction. The species has been flagged nationally as declining in distribution, but on the reverse side of things, in Yorkshire, the species is actually increasing in range. The second new species to be caught in Warwickshire was the marsh oblique bard at Compton Burney on the 27th of July. And that was recorded by Bob Cox in his moth trap on a BBC Endeavour group. It is a diminutive species. It's only measuring 14 millimeters in wingspan, which could suggest that it's possibly been overlooked in the past. And not much is known about this moth because its food plant, larval food plant, is unknown. And it's a species that inhabits marshy ground, so Compton Burney is the ideal sort of habitat. So it could be a new colonisation. And this species nationally has actually increased in range. The third new species to be recorded in Warwickshire was on the 7th of October. And this was Bradford's flame shoulder. Very exciting moth because it was formerly, right up through the 1990s and early 2000s, only a rare immigrant to the British Isles. But after 2000, it slowly became established on the south coast of England. So this year, 2021, it had a really excellent year. It proliferated. Large numbers were caught in moth traps on the south coast. So it's probably one for the future, perhaps a future colonizer for Warwickshire. Now this moth is quite spectacular looking, and I was absolutely astounded to find this species in my moth trap on the 19th of October. It's called the Tunbridge Wells gem, a very rare migrant from North Africa and the Canary Islands. There are less than 30 records in the UK since first in 1870 at Tunbridge Wells. And this species is not recorded as breeding in Europe. So we know that this moth that entered my moth trap on that particular night is a long distance traveller. Now the Atlantic pressure charts for the day in question show a weather front stretching from Iberia right up to the Midlands, the English Midlands. And not only that, but the special ingredient was a warm front moving up from subtropical areas right up through into the Midlands, arriving in the early hours. Chifali on the Midlands Today weather forecast at lunchtime on the 19th of October gave a nice detailed forecast on the nighttime temperatures and humidity.
Muggy as well, temperatures rising to between 18 to 19 Celsius, when normally you'd expect values of around 13 to 14. Now, those are the sorts of values we're going to see through tonight. So it's a very warm and humid night, temperatures down to 13 to 14 Celsius. The rain eventually clearing, but those showers developing from the southwest towards the end of the night.
The night was also special for me at Charlcote because I recorded a second new species in the garden moth trap. Very unusual after 53 years of running a moth trap to record 2 new species in one night. And I also recorded dew exclusia, which is showing signs of early stage colonisation in South Warwickshire. Before 2021, there'd only been 4 records of dew exclusia. Yet in 2021, there were 5 records recorded at Radford Semley, at Wrighton Falls Country Park, 2 at Long Compton, and the one in question here at Charlcote. L-album wainscot, a species which had only recorded last year at Bitternong Avon, was recorded 3 times in 2021, suggesting colonisation. This is formerly a rare migrant and South Coast coloniser, and the records in 2021 from Rugby, Wrighton Falls and Bidford for the 2nd year running, suggest the early stage colonisation. Tree lighting beauty has been highlighted as a species responding to climate change, spreading quickly northward and colonising in many new counties, including Warwickshire. Amazingly, at Ashnell in Rugby, it was recorded 37 times in a garden moth trap. Now, this garden is rather special because it also had a dark crimson underwing, which is the 3rd year running this species has been recorded in Rugby. Dark crimson underwing appears to be colonising woodlands, its prime habitat, and it was noted in Oversley Wood in August of 2021 as well for the first time. Now next year, 2022, there's going to be some field meetings through butterfly conservation to monitor numbers, especially in Oversley Wood, of this exotic species. Talking about exotic species, the iconic Clifton nonpareil has gone from strength to strength in Warwickshire. It really has kicked in, not only in woodlands where aspen, the larval food plant, is frequent, but also in garden moth traps. And long may it continue, because this spectacular moth is a very welcome addition to the Warwickshire. Gypsy moth, first recorded last year, 2020, at Bidford, came in with 2 more records this year. Another one at Bidford, and also at Longcompton, which suggests that it's spreading in from the south, where in Oxfordshire it is already established. And although the female can't fly very far because it's so heavy, it does suggest that it's slowly moving, perhaps through larvae being blown in the wind. Kent black arches, another species which is a new colonizer to Warwickshire, was recorded at Brighton Falls Country Park for the first time, and also at Draycott Water. This species appears to be spreading in from the east and could well become established in other parts of Warwickshire in future years. Brighton Falls Country Park had another very good moth this year, the mocker. And the mocker has been recorded very infrequently over the years in Warwickshire. Since the Victoria County history, when it was first recorded, there's only been 6 records. Angle striped sallow is the species which has its strongholds in Warwickshire, in the north of the county, around the Atherstone area, and also colonies in Sutton Park. There are colonies in Oversley Wood and Louisley Wood in the west of the county, but during 2021, it appears to be spreading into the Prince Philip Woodland complex with a record at Brandon Wood. Finally, I'm going to return back to the migrants, because 2021 was a really special year for bedstraw hawk moth. There were 3 recorded during 2021, which it makes it the best year since 1977 in Warwickshire. The bedstraw hawk moths were caught in moth traps at Binswood Avenue in Leamington Spa, at Brighton Falls Country Park. The photograph illustrated the actual specimen from there, and also from a garden here at Charlecote, which you can probably see out of the window here. So all in all, quite a good year for migrants. There were many other good species caught during 2021, and I can't mention them all due to lack of time, but they will all be reported in the annual report coming out in the new year. I'd like to thank all those people who contributed photographs. Thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully see you in reality in an AGM next year. Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Dave wanted to have another go. It was keen. Okay, everybody. Has anybody got any questions at all just before we go into a short break? Feel free to use the chat if you want to put any questions in the chat. During the break,
there is one, Steve. There's a question on the chat. asking what the moth after the bilberry pug was.
Good
Can you
question.
rewind the video?
I'll try and get back to you on that before the end of the session. What I'll do is during the break, just I'll carry on running the session. There's a slideshow of moths from Alan Pryor to have a look at that will go through the break. And then if you could return back for 3:20 prompt, and Jamie Wildman will be presenting his talk on the checkered skipper. So if you could be back for 3:20, that would be fantastic. Hopefully everybody's back from their break. Welcome back, everybody. I'll hand straight over to Jamie, I'll let you introduce yourself, Jamie. You can explain your background and stuff like that, and how you got involved with the checkered skipper. So over to you, Jamie.
Sure, thank you very much. Well, as I was very kindly introduced, my name's Jamie. I'm a postgraduate researcher in environmental science at the University of Northampton, studying the reintroduction and ecology of the checkered skipper butterfly in Rockingham Forest. And I've been researching the butterfly since 2018 when my PhD started, but I was very kindly invited along to Belgium with the butterfly conservation staff the first year of the reintroduction before my PhD officially began that October. So I was very fortunate to be part of the initial collection expedition to the southernmost parts of Belgium, and part of the kind of the core of the translocation project, really. I was very fortunate to see them released in Rockingham Forest in 2018, and as I say, I've been working on the reintroduction ever since. So I'm now in my writing up year, my 4th year of research, so I'm aiming to submit my thesis sometime late next summer or early autumn, and I've just submitted my first paper on museum specimens, which is largely what I'm going to cover today, to the Journal of Natural Science Collections, and subject to all clear from the 2 reviewers who the manuscript has been passed back to. It should be published in February of next year. So without further ado, I present the talk on the history of the checkered skipper in England, 1798 to 1976. And I say 1798 because that is the first record I have of the checkered skipper in England. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the species, it's a very, very small butterfly, aptly named the skipper, as it tends to skip across grass tops. It's a regular inhabitant. It's most commonly associated with deciduous woodland rides, but it's also been known to inhabit limestone grassland, heathland, fenland, and so forth. Its historic food plants, typically known to be the false-brome, the Brachypodium sylvaticum, and the tall grass Brachypodium pinnatum, but we also have seen it most frequently since the reintroduction on Calamagrostis epiceios. We know that the larvae are quite adaptable. It has a preference for very broad leaves of grass, and during the caterpillar's life cycle, the 5 instars that it goes through, it tends to create lovely little tubes out of the grass blades and then build something of equivalent to teepees from several grass blades connected together over the winter. It will overwinter as a caterpillar before entering pupation sometime in the very early spring, when it detects the weather starting to grow a bit warmer, and then it typically emerges in May at some point. Again, since the reintroduction and historically as well, it's most commonly associated in terms of nectar sources with Ajuga reptans, the bugle, bluebell, marsh thistle, and a wide range of other blue and purple and sometimes white flowers. It tends to have a bit of a color preference. And the males are very territorial. Anyone who's been up to Scotland will know that the males tend to occupy small territories of 50 meters or less, and they'll adopt vantage points on the tops of herbs, very tall grass plains, to give them good view of the overall habitat. And the females are very, very elusive by comparison. They'll often flutter around deep amongst the tussocks. So I mentioned about behavior, but this is where we start to come into the differences between the historic checker skipper and the contemporary reintroduced checker skipper, if you want to call it that. Ray Collier, who is an ex-warden of Castor Hanglands Nature Reserve, made a comment in one of his reports that the Scottish checker skipper, when he observed it before the English version's extinction in 1976, mentioned that the Scottish equivalent was a lot more territorially aggressive, and we're talking about the males, than what he believed the English checker skipper of the time to be. He described them as sedentary. Now, this is very different to the behavior that we commonly associate with not only the Scottish population checker skipper, but those on the continent in Belgium as well. And there's a bit of a train of thought that I'm pursuing now that suggests that the checker skipper in England weren't always sedentary, as Ray described them to be, that they were at some point in the past territorially aggressive, much like the Scottish and much like the Belgian checker skipper that we've collected. And I believe that due to a lot of agricultural intensification and restrictions in habitat availability across England that perpetuated through the 19th and the 20th century, the checker skipper became more sedentary. And Dempster's done some work in the early 90s, and Thomas as well in the 1980s, on UK butterfly species generally. And he suggests that colonies in England used to behave similarly, i.e. used to be more territorially aggressive, used to be more mobile and disperse over wider areas before they became limited by habitat restrictions. So the constriction, the isolation of woodland, the loss of grasslands due to agricultural intensification, urbanization, all these kind of factors that we commonly associate with habitat loss. So as a consequence, these checker skippers becoming isolated, restricted to very isolated woodland, they tend to mate, they tend to find mates that are similarly restricted, the less mobile ones that stay in core habitat. And obviously then you get what is effectively called an inbreeding depression. What Corchamp and Matilla et al. Describe as an expression of deleterious recessive allays. So these mates finding other sedentary mates, not the ones that have disappeared off to the far reaches of the woodland and beyond. And so you've just got a continuation, this progressively more sedentary species. So I believe that what we're calling the fitness decline of checker skipper populations prior to its extinction in 1976 were induced, this more sedentary behavior, through this low genetic drift, through this habitat isolation, populations not mixing amongst one another. And this is something that's been observed for other butterfly species as well, the swallowtail and the large blue that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which again, both became smaller and less mobile as habitat availability diminished. But what we've seen, and I'm very happy about this, it's very promising, is that the reintroduced stock that we've brought to Rockingham Forest from Belgium, from my personal observations, I believe them to be very, very territorially aggressive, very, very mobile, very free flying, which seems to be in stark contrast to the checker skippers, the historic checker skippers that Ray Collier observed at Castor Hanglands prior to its 1976 extinction. So in terms of mobility, I believe that the checker skipper that we have reintroduced shows a much better sign and a much more positive suggestions that it will be able to recolonize vacant habitat within the Rockingham Forest landscape due to the metapopulation model that butterfly conservation have kind of implemented through the reintroduction. So better habitat connectivity between these sub-landscapes, or between the sites in these sub-landscapes. So the signs are very, very good regarding the reintroduction versus what the historic checker skipper, its typical behavior prior to its extinction in 76. So if we jump back and say, what was the timeline of the checker skipper? What do we know of it? Well, I'll come to the amount of records that we've got to inform this timeline in a short while. But for those of you who don't know, the checker skipper's Latin name is Carterocephalus palemon. It was defined by Pallas in 1771, but it is a good 27 years before the first record in my database and all of the museum specimens, all of the records that I've collected. 1798 in Clapham Park Wood in Bedfordshire. Unfortunately, I can't be as positive about the number of Warwickshire records as I was when I gave a version of this talk to the Kent and Essex branch a couple of weeks ago, who have got a huge amount of checker skipper records. It's only, as far as I'm aware, 2 records of the checker skipper from Warwickshire that I've accepted into my database. So I can't, unfortunately, kind of bolster up Warwickshire's credentials in terms of the checker skipper. However, we do have a great now documentation of how the checker skipper populated the English landscape prior to its extinction. We had the first Cambridgeshire record in the early 1800s in 1802, and an expansion across the landscape to many of the sites that we now commonly associate with the checker skipper in Northamptonshire and Cambridgeshire, at sites like Fineshade, at Firmin Woods and Castor Hanglands, which is considered the historic stronghold of the species. And the most records from its stronghold at Castor Hanglands in 1932, but it was only 42 years after that fact that the last ever record came from that site in 1974, and only 2 years after that that the checker skipper was considered extinct altogether, a declaration made in 1975 by Lynn Farrell and cohorts from the Monkswood Experimental Research Station situated at Monkswood. If we fast forward 42 years to 2018, we have the reintroduction that Butterfly Conservation is now working on. And so far, I'm very glad to report that the reintroduction seems to have been a success. I also note here for the first time, and this is something we'll come to in more detail shortly, that in the 1950s, we have what I've considered to be the precipitous decline of the species in England. So until the mid-1900s, we've really got an ascendancy for the checker skipper. And then following the 1950s and the late 1940s, early 1950s, we have a very, very quick, very precipitous cliff edge of a decline leading to 1976. So I've mentioned briefly about museum specimens. And what I've been working on whilst looking into the history of the species is creating a huge database of checkered skipper records. This has been a work in progress now, and it's effectively complete because this is essentially the contents of the paper that I'm seeking to have published in February of next year is on all of the records that I've collated, and a vast majority of the 3,800 plus records that I now have of the checker skipper in England prior to 76 are from museum specimens. I originally started my foundational data set, if you'd like to call it that, from Butterfly Conservation, the Butterflies for the New Millennium dataset only contained 266 records. Now, if you put that in context in relation to how many records I've obtained, as demonstrated on the figure to the right, I have a total of 2,175 museum specimens that I've added to this database, and see how massively that number dwarfs the existing UK database records that we have from the B&M. I've also collated 465 records that I've obtained from private specimens, so large collections that are from private collectors in Wiltshire and other places across the country. And I've also extracted over 600 records from published texts as well, so things like Lynn Farrell's report for the JCCBI that was published in 1973 on the status of the checker skipper. So we've really massively increased our knowledge about the range of the checker skipper prior to 76, in-field its distribution, and effectively proved its strongholds in Northamptonshire, Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire that were kind of presupposed, but now pretty much conclusively defined thanks to my research. And this is how all that data looks when it's visualized. On the left, we have figure 2, which is English checker skipper C. palemon distribution of what I've called all records meeting quality criteria. So what I've effectively had to say with a lot of the data I've received is, does it have locality information, i.e. the site the record came from, and is that very conclusive and very clear? Or can I attribute a site that's called a settlement, like Corby or a town, and can I attribute that to a woodland that's very nearby? And if it doesn't have that information plus a date, then I basically had to write it off. So I've only accepted records that have had locality and date information, so a very clear provenance and a very clear time as well. So there are over 400 records that I've actually collected from museums that have been discarded and put into an incomplete data set. So I've only included the 3,800 records that are what I consider complete, that meets my quality control standards, and have been put into these maps here. So the left map, we have all of our records, and just to offer a bit of a clearer demonstration of where the strongholds of the species were, on the right hand side, I've only included records from counties with over 10 records meeting my quality control standards. So there's a very clear demonstration here that the species is very much biased to the Midlands, to the north of Northamptonshire, to Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire, very much so, as I've come to find through the research, to Leicestershire and Rutland as well, and also Lincolnshire, which was the focus of the late 1990s, early 2000s failed reintroduction attempt up there. So again, this is how 3,800 records look when they're mapped out versus the 266 that we had prior to the commencement of my research project. Now, you'd also notice on the map that we just looked at, I'm sure those of you are eagle-eyed, that we have a few records on the south coast. And it's been speculated upon that there was something of a southern population that existed perhaps prior to the species being defined by Pallas in 1771. Perhaps the species was dominant across the southern counties on the south coast in Devon and Dorset and Kent and so forth. But by the time that record collecting came about, by the time that specimens started to be collected by people going out into the field with nets, that these southern colonies were already waning. But there's a bit of a train of thought from a few researchers out there, Tom Brereton, formerly of Butterfly Conservation, and John Moore, who studied the Lincolnshire introduction and submitted his thesis in 2004, that there were southern colonies. Now, I tend to agree. In Tom's words, he believes that the checker skipper must have colonized England from the continent, and one might suppose that initially, that after colonizing the southern counties, that the species essentially graduated northwards and found its strongholds in Rockingham Forest and further north in Lincolnshire shortly afterwards. But as I mentioned before, Leicestershire and Rutland have come about as being very, very significant in terms of checker skipper records. I found a site called Luffenham Heath in the county that was effectively the species stronghold in the county prior to its extinction. Is one of the last ever sites recorded for the butterfly in England in '76. So we have 37 Devon and Dorset, Kent records as well, spanning a very, very wide range of time. So I'm very much open to thoughts after I've concluded my talk on whether this southern colony really existed, whether these are just records that are anomalies, that are red herrings, whether collectors collected butterflies from sites in Rockingham Forest and merely labelled them with their place of residence on the south coast sometime afterwards. So this is where 3,800 records or so, this is where they break down. This is where they come from. You'll notice at the top of the POPs leaderboard, we've got Northamptonshire and Cambridgeshire. These were really the two dominant counties, with Lincolnshire also up there, Huntingdonshire, Leicestershire and Rutland, as we talked about. A few records from Northamptonshire as well, on the other side of the Lincolnshire border, and a few from Beds as well. It's interesting here that although we had the first ever record from Clapham Park Woods in Bedfordshire, you see how insignificant the county is, generally speaking, in regard to checker skipper records. So again, some places that we don't commonly consider strongholds for the checker skipper tend to come up in the earlier records, slightly more southerly than sites in counties like Northamptonshire and Cambridgeshire. And unfortunately, yes, I'm very sad to report that that very tiny sliver a long way down this leaderboard is Warwickshire. Again, I'd very much like to be able to say to you all that we have hundreds of records from the county, but that is sadly not the case. So I mentioned that Castor Hanglands was a stronghold for the species because of the amount of records we've collected from the site. Prior to my research beginning, it was always considered a stronghold by ex-wardens like Ray Collier and John Robinson, who worked there in the 60s and the 70s. But all my research has really done is reinforced how significant the site was historically. And it shows also that the sites that have been prioritized in the Rockingham Forest landscape by butterfly conservation for the purposes of the reintroduction, for habitat management and so forth, like Wakeley Woods, like Furman Woods, are significant historically as well, that they were suitable sites for the species and could very well be so in the present day too. Skellingthorpe in Lincolnshire is really the only site from the Lincolnshire north or south that has a large weighting within the data set. It's mostly confined to sites in Northamptonshire, Cambridgeshire, and as I mentioned, Leicestershire and Rutland. So I talked about the precipitous decline, and this is very much where we can illustrate it, where it's visualized. You'll see a vast majority of the records that I have are from the 1940s, so the 1940 to 1949 period, which is followed by a very, very quick drop off. It's a very gradual ascendancy in the early 90s that peaks in the 1940 to 1949 period, and then incredibly, and it is quite striking every time I consider it, even though I've studied this butterfly for several years now, just how quick that disappearance is. in all of my research, I really was expecting at some point to find a record from the late 60s, from the late 70s or the early 80s that conclusively disproved the fact that the checker skipper was rendered extinct so quickly. But I haven't done. The last record that was known about at the time was 75, and I've only been able to surprise Lynn Farrell by demonstrating to her that a record was submitted to the 1982 edition of the Entomologist's Review, I think it was the Entomologist Journal, one of the two, by an A. Archer Locke of a sighting in 1976, which Lynn didn't know about when they declared that the species was extinct in England. So I've only really been able to push the extinction date back 1 year. It's interesting though, it's just a bit of a topic of conversation that Lynn and her colleagues made the declaration of the checker skipper's extinction in 1975, so that 76 was the extinction year, because the last record that they had, of course, at that moment in time was from 75. But if they had known about any records from 76 in the time, they would have been able to declare the extinction date as 77. So it's not enough to say, hey, you know, make my mark on history and say the checker skipper was declared extinct 1 year later. But because the last record is from 76, in my mind, whenever I talk about the species now, I consider its extinction year informally as 1977. And just to show again how precipitous this decline was, R.E.M. Pilcher in 1961 in his report said that, the checker skipper was an insect in no apparent danger of extinction, but well worth some trouble to maintain in good numbers. This is only 15 years before we lost the species from England altogether. So it is a real, I think one of the things that I could potentially broadcast more after I finish my research as really like a warning sign for the present and the future in terms of how we're protecting and conserving species and habitats is just how quickly we can lose them. The checker skipper has really brought that home, that people were complacent in the early 1960s and didn't think we're at risk of losing a species altogether from the country. Something as iconic as a checker skipper, as beautiful as it is, with its very eccentric behaviors and its idiosyncrasies, that we can lose a species like that in basically a little over 15 years, from people saying it's at no risk of being lost to it being gone altogether. So it really brought home just how quickly things can change, and how quickly we need to act to protect species when we realize that they're in trouble. And this decline, you'll notice from figure 7 above, from John Moore's research project, from his thesis that he submitted in 2004, he suggested that decline generally started to begin in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. You'll see the peak in his chart between 1950 and 1959, with a drop off shortly afterwards in the early 60s. But my peak is very much in the late 50s, in the late 40s, and then decline starts to begin in the 50s. So there's only ever such a slight shift, but it just shows how thorough John's research was when he collected data on historic checker skipper specimens from museums as well, that also fed into my research. Just how he suggested some good clues, essentially, a good starting point that haven't been too dissimilar from my findings. But again, it just serves to reinforce just how quickly we lost the checker skipper from sites in England. It's a regular, consistent occupation of sites, which then peaks in the 1940s, and we'll go into slightly what that's about now. Why is that peak in the 1940s? Why is there that gradual ascendancy that's followed by a very quick decline? Well, I'm pretty confident now in saying that it was due to a lot of woodland management changes that occurred around the 1940s and 1950s periods, and slightly earlier in the 30s as well, that we saw, especially in the 1900s, a mass abandonment of coppicing of woodland, and a lot of infilling them with a lot of high forest, and generally a decline in the quality and availability of suitable habitat on woodland rides. There was mass clear felling and coniferization that tended to dominate a lot of woodlands and rocky forests that the checker skipper once called home. So this all happened around, all of this clear felling and this opening up of rides happened in the World War II period, a vast majority of it in the late 30s and the early 40s. And obviously anyone who's familiar with woodland management, that once coppicing occurs, you have kind of a very a sunning up of rides that lasts about 5 or 10 years. And if that's not followed by management, then you'll see things very quickly shade over again. And especially in the case of coniferization, that we saw a lot of infilling with high forest and a lot of conifer planting and a mass abandonment of coppicing, that all of a sudden rides just shaded over very quickly. So you can imagine how quickly nectar availability, how quickly scrub would encroach upon on sites on woodland rides that were not managed. alongside the woodland, how quickly the habitat quality would deteriorate. And that's very, very clearly represented in both the museum specimens and the site occupation as well, that we see both decline very rapidly after the 40s. And again, this is the extinction trajectory. Now, although this doesn't match up perfectly with the site occupation map we've just seen, this extinction trajectory once again illustrates just how much of a cliff edge the checker skipper fell off in the late 40s and the early 50s. That what we have basically is a year zero on the left-hand side. So we have all sites from which the checker skipper was present at. And as each last record from each of these sites the checker skipper was present at passes, we take a mark off the graph. So we see it's relatively stable until the 1940s, and then all of these last records from all these sites start to follow in very, very quick succession, all the way through to 1976 when we have our last site altogether. And that was from a combination of both Loughlam Heath and Ringhaw in Rutland and Northamptonshire, respectively. And this is a table from Ray Collier's 1986 report. It's not just the checkered skipper that was seemingly lost from a lot of the strongholds in Northamptonshire and Cambridgeshire in the late 50s and 60s, but from sites that, again, you'll remember from our graph before, from sites like Bedford Purlieu, from Monkswood, and from Castor Hanglands. There are a lot of last records for UK butterfly species in the 60s and just prior to it as well. So it's not just the checkered skipper that seemingly suffered from this declining, degrading habitat quality across Rockingham forests and Cambridgeshire, and a lot of fritillary species. You can see here a lot of prior to 1960s or early 1960s. So there's a potential that the checker skipper was slightly more vulnerable than some of these more abundant species, but a lot of them tended to suffer the same fate, according to Collier's report. So as I've mentioned, really this is to essentially sum up what all of the museum specimens that I've collected. They've just reinforced really that a lot of the speculation about the impact of clear felling, about coppice abandonment and high forest conversion, about conifer afforestation, and also agricultural intensification that resulted in the loss of a lot of grassland habitat, a lot of heathland, especially in Rutland and Leicestershire, that linked a lot of the sites like Loughlam Heath with some of the smaller woodland complexes there together. But it really is a case of declining habitat quality and changes in woodland management that contributed to the checker skipper's downfall. I have mentioned at the bottom in kind of very, very faded text that although collecting, one might be tempted to assume that because I've collected so many records from the checker skipper across England, that collecting was responsible. But it generally, from what I've learned through my research, is that collecting really didn't have any significant impact whatsoever on the loss of the checker skipper. It was a line of thought I was pursuing at some point through my research, but it has proven not to be a chief factor in the loss. We had some extreme weather events as well. Maybe some of you are familiar with the droughts that we saw in the late 1950s and the winters of the early 1960s as well. But for vulnerable populations, if anything, they were just death knells, really. If you've got a very vulnerable small population of checker skipper, it's not going to take a lot to wipe it off the map altogether with an especially bad winter or some droughts. And there's also something else, particularly on grassland as well. The myxomatosis outbreak of 1953 would have relaxed a lot of grazing pressure on a lot of grasslands. So they would have become more favorable in the short term, but within about 15, 20 years, 20 to 30 years, these sites would have very quickly started to scrub up again and become unsuitable. So we have a bit of an optimum period, really, in the late 1940s, in the early 1950s, when we've got great wide sunny open rides because of a lot of clear felling, but the complete absence of subsequent management and the delayed impact of things like myxomatosis basically created a perfect storm that resulted in a loss of the checker skipper in England altogether. So it's not a single factor that resulted in the loss of the species from our country, but a combination of many, many things. It's multifactorial, but it largely revolved around declining woodland management and changes in woodland management, agricultural intensification, and things like recreational development as well. At Loughlam Heath in particular, which was, as the name suggests, a heathland prior to being converted to a golf course in 1909 to 1911. And amazingly, the checker skipper held on there, probably in the rough, the ribbons around the greens all the way up to 1976, which again was the site that the Checker Skipper was found at last prior to its extinction, alongside Ring Hall in Northamptonshire. So I'm very delighted that the Checker Skipper has been reintroduced. I think it stands a great chance of success given the amount of work that Butterfly Conservation and its partners are putting into woodland management across the Rocky and Forest networks. And I really, really hope that many of you in Warwickshire can take the trip across the county borders and come and visit the species next summer and in the following years, because I'm very, very optimistic about its progress. I think it stands a great chance at long-term re-establishment in England. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have to follow. I've got a ton of references. If any of you are especially academic, you can possibly, don't be too harsh on me if they're all not perfect. But yes, just a ton of acknowledgements, so many people to thank. The 2 Butterfly Conservation branches that have financially supported me, BC for all the mentoring, help and support, and obviously in the University of Northampton and my supervisors as well. So thanks very much. I'll hand it back over to you.
Well, I've got to say thank you very much, Jamie. Fantastic talk. Really exciting about the potential success of the Checkered Skipper. I'm going to hand over to Steve now, who's probably got any questions from the chat room that haven't already been answered.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions. So Steve Wright asks, will there be any scoring of how aggressive the Checkered Skipper is over time in the reintroduction areas?
That's a really interesting line of inquiry. Yeah, I mean, I've done some behavioural studies that have largely revolved around how long the Checkered Skipper spends in flight, how long it nectars for, how long it roosts, things like that, typical behavioural stuff. But it'd be interesting to devise a methodology that's, I don't know how you would describe it, marks how aggressive a species has been, right? I have made some observations about whether from its territorial perches, whether the male intercepts other butterflies, other pollinators, whether it is combative when it comes to obtaining nectar from its primary food plants. But yes, I think it would be very interesting, possibly for a subsequent research project, to look at how territorially aggressive the English now reintroduced Checker Skipper is over time versus the Scottish population and the Belgians, to see whether the habitat availability restrictions that I commented on have been reversed really by the improved landscape management really. But yes, it's a very, very interesting point. It's definitely something that I'd be interested in looking at.
Okay, and a couple more. So I think it's Scott Hackett says, where did the Scottish population come from? Did it originate from Northern Europe or Southern Europe, or has there been any genetic tests to work that out?
Well, and I don't think there's been any genetic tests to determine exactly where they came from. I have no bloody idea how they ended up in Scotland.
I might be able to help with that one. I think I can't remember his name, from Scotland. When they first thought of doing the reintroduction of the Checkered Skipper in Lincolnshire, I think they did do some genetic tests and found that the Scottish population was more related to the Scandinavian, and that's why they originally sort of selected Belgium for the donor population for us.
Yep. Interesting. Yeah, that might have slipped my mind, because I know Domino Joyce did some genetic work prior to the Lincolnshire reintroduction. But I haven't really looked into that in too much detail, because the genetic side of things isn't something that I pursued as part of my research. But yeah, it fascinates me that somebody just stumbled upon a population of Checker Skipper up in Scotland when they were so well known about in England for such a long period of time. That blows my mind in a way.
Ravenscroft, I think.
Yes, yeah. Ravenscroft has been incredibly influential in how I've interpreted the Checker Skipper's behaviour in Rocky and Forest, because I originally came. Now this is very interesting. If you'll apologies for going off on a bit of a tangent here. But when I first started looking into the Checker Skipper, a lot of the research that I read, the existing research, suggested that the Checker Skipper was very sedentary, that I was expecting it to be reintroduced to Rocky and Forest and for them to fly a couple of 100 meters at the absolute maximum. And so it took me a while to come to Ravenscroft's absolute tome of a thesis, because that thing is huge and incredibly detailed and an absolutely fantastic piece of work. But he came to the conclusion that they were actually a lot more mobile. And so I started chatting to John Moore about that, and he tended to think the same. And I'm not sure it's common knowledge yet, and I don't think I'm breaking any rules by telling you this, but I found through the photographic work that I've been doing, so a lot of volunteers have been coming along to the site, and doing volunteering work and taking photographs for me of the checker skippers they encounter. And after that, I've been matching those images up with images that other volunteers have taken. And through that process, I found that a checker skipper this year was found to have flown over 1,600 meters, so 1.6 kilometers from the site that it was first observed at. Now, to my mind, that does not sound like a particularly sedentary species. And especially this is what I was talking about, being very optimistic about the prospect of recolonization of the vacant habitats that Butterfly Conservation has been working on managing, is that within these metapopulation networks that they devised, each of these sites are less than 1 kilometer from one another. So if we have checker skipper that can fly 1.6 kilometers, there's nothing to suggest that they aren't capable of bridging these gaps from woodland site to woodland site and recolonizing vacant habitat. So again, it flies in the face really of what I tended to assume very early on in my research project about how mobile the species was. I tend to think it can fly a lot further than people previously, or on the large, assumed it was capable of doing so. And Ravenscroft was very influential in kind of colouring my my perspective on it.
Yeah, just finally, it was really one of my thoughts really in this sort of cliff edge decline that we had in the sort of late 50s, 60s. You mentioned the myxomatosis outbreak, I think it was 1953. And then I'm just thinking about things like the use of chemicals on agricultural land and drift and stuff like that, which we never really considered back in the day when we were using these chemicals. Was it basically a perfect storm? And is that why we perhaps are also seeing those mass extinctions of other species? And I would suggest that it's possibly highly likely that that's the case, and that it's a massive lesson for us to learn, having just had the COP in Glasgow, that perhaps we're at a similar sort of tipping point now. And if we don't change our ways a little bit, we could see other species drop off a cliff, just like the checkered skipper did.
Absolutely. I'd like nothing more, not in a selfish way or an egotistical way, not remotely, but I would love my research to be an example, as used as a case study, as just how quickly we can lose species. You know, I don't care about my name being attributed to it, as long as people remember just how quickly, as long as this puts in front and center just how quickly we can lose species. I think it's a fantastic example of just how quickly things can go wrong. And once they're gone, they're gone. You know, we can't do a single thing about that. We've lost that entire genetic. There will never be an English checker skipper again. You know, ultimately, although we've reintroduced the Belgian lot, they're different. We've always lost the English checker skipper. But it's interesting that you make a comment about the about pesticides and insecticides and so forth, because I've looked into that. And again, a lot of the links that all the stuff about coppicing and so forth, it's all circumstantial. You know, I can't transport myself back in time and look at woodland in the 60s and 70s and see things exactly as they were back then. You know, I have to make these links like a criminal investigator, like a lepidopterist investigator of a crime scene, try and piece all these pieces together. But it seems like looking through a lot of Forestry Commission booklets from the 1950s and so forth, and the late 1940s, that's when they started to use a lot of pesticides and things. And it's not something that I've focused on, and it might not play a large part in the thesis write-up, but it's something that I'm speculating about. And it is very speculative because I've got no conclusive evidence. But there is the potential from drift from agricultural land, even stuff that the Forestry Commission was using on a lot of its sites in Rockingham Forest in the 40s and 50s. There is specific cases, would you believe it, of them using a weed killer to target Calamagrostis apicios, which is one of the food plants that the checker skipper is now utilizing in Rockingham Forest. So, you know, I'm unfortunately not a chemical expert. I can't tell you the impact that they could have had, but Jeff Ollerton, who's my supervisor, has done a lot of work on the impact of insecticides, and we know about the association with bees. We know about how insecticides and things, especially in use on crops on agricultural land, how that affects bees and so forth and other pollinators. So there's a good chance that it also affected the checker skipper, but it's whether a lot of these chemicals were used in close proximity to existing habitat that I just don't know about. I'm not sure there's the documentation or the evidence out there.
Again, Jamie, this might help that Chris Van Sway from the Dutch Butterfly Federation has done an awful lot with nitrogen deposition.
Yes.
And what they were finding, because we think agriculture is bad, but when you see some of the pictures from Holland, it's even worse. and they found that in the middle of their best nature reserves, they found nitrogen deposition from agricultural drift. And the other thing he's done a bit of work on recently, I don't know if there's any papers, but what the big worry is abandonment in Eastern Europe, because people are abandoning the meadows up there. So that might mimic very quickly the sort of coaching sort of stuff where things get shaded out.
Yeah, I think that's something that I've been asked before, is about how this work in Rockingham Forest, does this mimic what's happened on the continent? Is this something that they've experienced too? So it's a case of, I'm almost going to collect all of my evidence and then say, right, did this happen in Belgium as well? And I'm waiting for someone to turn around to me and say, no, this is not remotely what happened at all. I just completely discredit all the work I've done. But yeah, it seems to be it's a recurring theme that seems to be coming up quite often.
And S. Hackett again has a question. He's got his raised hand. Have you got a question you want to ask? You'll have to unmute if you have.
Yeah. So, Jamie, you said something there. You could identify a checker skipper 1,600 meters away. Can you identify each individual one? It's something we've been doing for grizzle skippers. I know they've got more spots.
Yes.
Can you? Because that's a way that for small populations, it's a really good way of monitoring small populations. Mike's populations of grizzle skippers, there's too many hundreds of them. Is that something you can do?
Yes. So what we've effectively done now, butterfly conservation, understandably, were very protective about the idea of mark release recapture. Yeah. Obviously, we have a very, very small, delicate population, and we didn't want to risk causing any damage by interfering with them too much. So what we effectively devised is an alternative that it's mark release recapture, but using photography. Now, fortunately, as you mentioned, the grizzle skipper don't have that many identifiable features, but we're very lucky with the checkered that they have a brown backdrop against these gorgeous golden scales. And thankfully, due to advancements in technology, we're now at the point where volunteers who have been walking the sites, thank the Lord, have extremely sophisticated photographic equipment with them and can take extremely high resolution photography. So any volunteers who come along, especially this year, as it's something I very actively pursued, was I was telling volunteers, try and get, first and foremost, get your sighting down, but get a great picture for me as well. So what have I done after the fact, and it's something I'm actually working on at this very moment, I might carry on with it this afternoon if I don't fall asleep because I'm shattered, is identifying, what I've done already is identify as many checker skippers individuals as I can. And it's a case of now, as you say, determining population size and how healthy the population is using that photographic equipment. So yeah, it's entirely possible, especially with something like the checker skipper, to use that as a substitute for MRR.
I'm quite interested by that, actually, because
skipper work.
I'm quite interested because I told Butterfly Conservation about this about 4 or 5 years ago, and they poo-pooed it for grizzled skippers. I'm glad they're using it now. It's brilliant.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not perfect, unfortunately, because obviously
you
can't. You know, there's a lot of photographs I've got that just you can't do anything with. So there are definitely more. We've seen more checker skippers out there, and I have photographs of them. But it's just frustrating sometimes looking at it and saying, I can't say conclusively whether that's a different one or the same one. But it's good enough for what I need it for, as like a proof of concept or something to go in the thesis, and say that this is a reasonable substitute if you're dealing with an especially delicate population of reintroduced butterflies that you don't want to risk damaging or harming. So I think I'm hoping to prove that it's a pretty solid substitute. But I've got to learn a piece of software called Mark in order to calculate the population size. So that's my next challenge after I've done my initial identification work.
Yeah, and what you can also do, what we've worked out this is, because you can see them sort of slowly degrading over a few weeks, so you can work out their lifespan, but you can also work out the difference between males and females. I don't think you can tell males and females of checkers. So I look forward to seeing that. That sounds great. Yeah,
it's great because the photographic work has had a couple of really fantastic surprises. Exactly as you say, we've had a few images of checker skippers that have been in perfect condition that have been seen one day, and then I've all of a sudden came upon in the database, I've realized, oh wait, this is the same checkered, look, that mark's identical, and it's a really degraded tatty one that's from 10 days later. So it's great because we were able to determine lifespan as well, exactly how long these butterflies were on the wing for, which is absolutely fascinating because you can see what they've gone through from this perfectly pristine butterfly to something that's far more farm that are created and withered and on the verge of being lost altogether. So I can only thank the volunteers for that as well, because that's all on them. You know, being a student, I'm unfortunately not able to afford £4,000 or £5,000 cameras and walk around a wood in retirement taking butterfly photographs. But they've been awesome because they've sent all of their photographs and said, you know, do whatever you want with them, and I've really appreciated that. We've
got people to do it just with phones.
I mean, you can, but the vast majority of times there's sometimes the differences, even with the checkers, can be so minimal. And it's sometimes a case of a couple of scales or the shape of one particular mark. So yeah, it's, although phones can, I mean, there's an aberration out there that we saw this year that Susanna O'Riordan, who's project officer for the Roots of Rockingham project, or was formerly, and now it's in its different funding cycle. But she took a photograph of an aberration, but it was on a phone. So unfortunately, it wasn't clear enough to be able to conclusively see what aberration it was and whether it had reappeared somewhere else in the wood at a later date.
Sorry, I realise I'm hogging the questions, but it's great. Sorry about
that. No, that's awesome. No, thank you for the questions.
Thanks, Scott. So yeah, I'd just say as well, your presentation actually really backs up what especially Mike and his volunteers are doing conservation wise on the reserves, and then what Keith's doing with these annual checks of the data. Being right on top of the data is really, really important, so we can spot these cliff edge drops if they come sooner rather than later, before it really is too late, and Mike and his team can obviously get out there and make sure that we don't lose these species before it's too late. Okay, has anybody else got any questions for Jamie?
I'll just come in. You talking about maybe visiting next year or whatever. Is there anything been said as to when we can sort of officially visit the?
Definitely keep your eyes and ears peeled. I'm pretty sure that BC and its partners will make the site or sites public at some point, but obviously I'm not privy to release those details. So that's up to headquarters. But yeah, absolutely keep. The whole goal of this project ultimately is public engagement. And it's being able to open the sites up to the public and say, hey, come and look at this beautiful butterfly that we've released to woodland. So it's not a case of it wanting to be secretive in the long term, but yeah, it absolutely will be made public at some stage. But it's just a case of, obviously, I can totally understand the perspective and the motivation behind keeping it quiet and keeping it secluded, because if you get too much public interest, it could be a nightmare. You know, it's so much to monitor. You have got habitat quality issues to factor into that. We have had a few people encroaching, but yeah, we've ultimately just asked people to be incredibly patient for the meantime and try and understand where we're coming from. But yeah, the goal ultimately will be to make it public. But yeah, if you just keep a lookout for any Checker Skipper news, but really, I'm sure they'll be continuing doing monitoring work. So if anybody's interested in visiting and getting involved and seeing the Checker Skipper, monitoring and volunteering is the way to go, is the way to do that, because then you're giving back to the research, you're giving back to the idea of how the butterflies dispersing across the landscape, you know, and you're feeding something back. So if anybody's really eager to get out there, then kind of get in touch and offer your volunteering hours, and in doing so you'll be paid in return with a sighting of a Checker Skipper or two.
Absolutely. The other thing is the Checker Skipper pub still there at Arundel?
Well, it closed for a while, but it actually is. Yeah, it's still back. Yeah, it's under new management now, and it's returned. So yeah, I mean, again, it shows you how iconic the butterfly was in Northamptonshire. They even had a pub named after it. You know, it's incredible that it's back in the landscape again. But one thing that has been underplayed is just how significant I think Ashton Wold actually was as a historic site, because although I've collected this many records, it's not perfect. It's never going to be anywhere near perfect or incredibly accurate representation of how the butterfly was distributed. For example, in Lynn Farrell's JCCBI report from '73, it's got a mention of the Checker Skipper from every year from 1901 to 1923, but it's just a mention. It doesn't say anything about abundance, about the number that were collected or captured or cited, anything like that. So I basically, in my database, each one of those years I've had to put as one sighting. So I personally think the Ashton Wold is probably far more significant and far more dominant, because Miriam Rothschild did a lot of studies on the butterfly there, and I know that the state generally was very keen on seeing the butterfly reintroduced there. So yeah, it's never going to be perfect, but it's there's enough data now to give us a really solid impression of exactly when the decline began, and it really does prove a lot of the existing research, which is great. There's been no massive surprises other than perhaps the Luffenham Heath, the Leicestershire and Rutland records that I pulled up in largely in great thanks to anybody who knows Adrian Russell, who's the BBC 55 moth recorder. He's done a phenomenal amount of work, and he's been so generous with the amount of Checker Skipper research data that he's contributed to the project. So I really have him to thank for that.
Jamie, just one other thought. It really builds on what you've said about the photographing and what we know what Scott's done with the Grizzle Skipper at one site in Warwickshire. If they're going to open it up to the public later on, I think it's a great opportunity if Doug and Dave want to get the photographs. I mean, I know Scott spends hours poring over them to sort of make sure he's identified individual specimens, but I think looking at the spread future, that might be a great way of actually recording that with this introduction of Checkered Skipper and doing perhaps even further research later down the line.
Yeah, I think it's viable. I do. I mean, it depends. I say that now, but it might be, I might come to a different conclusion after I've processed all the data in a month or so, and we actually get some population size estimate that is completely wildly off the mark. And my supervisors say, this is terrible, you can't include this in the thesis. So it's like a work in progress, but provisionally, it seems like it's a good substitute for actually doing proper MRR. You know, I know Tom Brereton, who was previously my supervisor from BT, he did work on the Grizzle Skipper in the 1990s, and he did a lot of MRR work. So it's just a case of really, determining whether this is a good enough substitute for that. I hope it is, because I think it shows great promise, especially if you don't want to start worrying about collecting and damaging specimens and releasing them and capturing them again. So
Scott will correct me on the numbers because it's actually in our next book, but what they did on one particular day at this site, Cuttle Pool, is they had several photographers actually on post in various places, and they took photographs of every Grizzle Skipper they saw. And then at the end of the day, they thought, well, I think I've seen 2, 3 maybe Grizzle Skippers. And by the end of the day, when they compared the photographs, they'd seen something like about 11.
Yeah.
but so again, as population sizes, it actually is a very good indication that you don't see all the specimens at a site, and even if they're very thorough. I don't know if you can correct me on that, Scott.
Yeah, those figures are almost correct, Mike. The thing that was the difficult thing is once you get a population size up to 60, it's almost impossible to do it. It's such a massive thing. When they're below 30 specimens over a year, which I assume the checkers may still be at the moment, you can do that. You can do it manually, but once it gets up to 60, you can do it, but it takes months and months to compare thousands of photos and delete and put them in timelines and things.
Yeah, I mean, I know I've chatted with a marine biologist friend of mine who's done work on dolphins, and obviously a dolphin fin is much more distinctive than an individual butterfly, but it would, if you could, I'd say the golden rule is if you can think it, it can probably be true at some point. And I imagine there will be some software, some AI, something somewhere along the lines that would be able to look at images of Checker Skippers and say, right, that's the same one, that's a different one, and do all that stuff automatically. But unfortunately, I'm not intelligent enough to start devising R scripts that can do that automatically. So it will take someone far more sophisticated than I am to get to that stage. But I hope that we do. I mean, what I would love to do is have a collaboration with something like the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and create some sort of like GPS transmitter that's small enough to put on a Checker Skipper's body. That would be fantastic. Yeah. So if we can get to the point where we can start making little like radio kits that are that small to put on a Checker Skipper with a blinking light, that would be fantastic. But until we get there, I think we're using more rudimentary methods of population size determination.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks for a really, really good report. I think everybody very, very interesting.
Thank you, Jamie.
No, you're very welcome.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. So down to me now. So just going to take you to a completely different place. I'll actually invite Keith, just to join me because he might be able to mention a few things that I forget along the way. Keith, if you fancy chipping in. So I'm just going to share my screen.
I'll say the memories up to it.
Yeah. Okay. 1 second. Okay, so we thought, what can we do for a talk to sort of finish the end of this AGM? and scratching our heads. And suddenly thought, well, myself, my wife Debbie, who's the membership secretary, Keith and Heather. Heather used to be the committee meeting what was the role? Meeting secretary. Well, I don't know. But anyway, we went to northern Greece in June 2019, and when we came back, I thought, oh, this might be a really, really good subject to do a presentation at an AGM. And then the world all changed, and COVID happened, and since then, none of us really have been able to leave the country. But since things hopefully are starting to improve, we thought, okay, maybe perhaps we can revisit our trip in 2019 to Lake Kirkini in northern Greece, and hopefully inspire you when you feel confident enough to perhaps look at travelling again to see some of Europe's butterflies. But we've also got, there's so much wildlife there. We're covering quite a few different things. So we've also got a lot of bird photography, with Keith being a fantastic birder as well. So it was really useful to have Keith there. I learned a huge amount about birds while we were there. So without further ado, I'll just explain where we were based. So we're based at this Lake Kirkini, which is right in the north of Greece on the Bulgarian and North Macedonian border, in a region called Central Macedonia. And we flew in from East Midlands Airport. We flew into, I think it was East Midlands, wasn't it, Keith? Such a long time ago, to Thessaloniki.
Birmingham.
It was what, Keith?
Birmingham we flew from.
Birmingham, that's right. So Birmingham to Thessaloniki, and then drove from Thessaloniki up to a small village called Mandraki, which is on the northern shores of Lake Kirkini. And this is just a Google Earth satellite view, just to give you an idea. So you can see Mandraki, which was the base where we stayed, and the mountain range that separates Greece from Bulgaria to the north, and Lake Kirkini just to the south. And then this map just shows some of the tracks that I recorded using some geotagging software that you can install on your mobile phone. You may have already heard of it before, because we have mentioned it in previous meetings, called Geotag Photos Pro. And you install that on your mobile phone, shove it in your pocket, and it records your route that you take. And then you can also use the data that you can pull off of that app to then geotag your photographs as well. So you can actually put your photographs in the landscape where you've been. So this just gives you an idea really of the sort of areas that we visited during the time. We had 2 weeks in June 2019. Unfortunately, I didn't record every single day. So there's about 4 days that I'm missing because I just forgot. That just gives you
spent in the pub.
Yes. So this was the accommodation. So we were very lucky. We had quite a large accommodation, just the upstairs area. Unfortunately, I did check to see whether this accommodation is still available, but I don't believe that it's open anymore, which is a real shame. That may be just because of lack of tourism at the moment. Maybe it will reopen maybe next year. But we did need a Jeep to get us around the area. So what's going on? This was pretty much the pose we had most of the time we were at in Greece, on the ground photographing butterflies. And that was the thing, armed with the cameras, we just went off to explore all the different areas. And this was one of the a ski slope that normally in the winter months is very popular with locals for skiing. But turned out to be a fantastic place for butterflies. Unfortunately, we got there, and then within half an hour or so, it started raining and everything disappeared, and it got very cold. So we didn't really get the most of that location, but it was a fantastic spot. So we were based at the north, on the northern edge of Lake Kirkini, and we could walk down from Mandraki village down to what's called Mandraki Harbour. It's about a 15-minute walk. And this was the sort of view you'd be greeted in the morning. I had been driving for a few days, so I missed this day and stayed in bed while the other three decided to go down and have a walk and enjoy the sunrise. So I missed this, unfortunately, but it's a beautiful location, so really recommend visiting. We did a boat trip out onto the lake. That was an early morning start as well, so we got to see the sunrise over the lake as we were moving across the lake to photograph some of the birds. And then this is a view of the Lake Kokini as well, again from the northern side, but slightly up into the foothills, just looking down. So Mandraki would be just to the sort of right of that screen. The village where we stayed is just to the right and just downhill a little bit from the foothills here. And what was fantastic about it is just the landscape and the variation between the landscapes. So there's a lot of agriculture near to the lake itself. And the lake is actually, I believe it's an artificial lake. It was dammed quite a while ago now. But there are areas where there's drainage channels and stuff like that, and wild areas near to the lake as well that were really good for wildlife. But then other areas that were heavily under agriculture, such as the sort of sunflower growth here. And then as you went up into the mountains, you've got the contrast again between sort of very much more rocky sort of agricultural land growing sort of grain and that type of thing, and then moving up into these narrow valleys which were absolutely full of wildflowers and absolutely buzzing with insects. So just got a little video. It's not great, it's just shot on my mobile phone, but it's just to sort of illustrate the sort of richness of wildflowers in some of these meadows that we encountered. And you should notice as well, there's loads of butterflies flying around. It was absolutely alive with butterflies. But it just gives you a sort of idea of the sort of habitats we were seeing. This was just up from that meadow, a place called the Church of Ascension at Ackled Dockery. And this was probably one of the best places we had in terms of number of species that we saw as we wandered around. And again, just to give you an idea of the sort of habitat that was up in that sort of region, very sort of limestoney, lots of wildflowers and scrub. And there was so much to see, you just didn't know where to look. And Keith's busily trying to take photographs, meanwhile Heather's trying to point out what's that. And we were doing that all the time. We were asking each other, what's that? Oh, have you seen that? And sometimes it was difficult to take it all in. There was just so much to see. So we've got buffalo grazing on the sort of the mud flat areas. This in the winter would be completely flooded, and they get quite harsh winters as well. So often it's snow covered as well. And in the village, first thing we noticed really with the storks nesting on the tops of the buildings, on the chimney stacks and stuff like that, and on the top of telegraph poles. And underneath there'd be Spanish sparrow, I think, nested in the storks' nests as well. And of course they're there because they're out foraging, taking frogs and that type of thing back to the nest to feed the chicks. So it's a fantastic place to visit and have a boat trip out to the lake, especially to see the pelicans. So there's the Dalmatian pelican, which are these, and then there's the white pelican, isn't there, Keith, that is just a slightly different species. So this is a Dalmatian, another Dalmatian, and they come really close to the boat, and they're absolutely huge things to experience close up.
It does help when the boatman carries a bit of fish that he chucks out. So they're obviously used to him being about, and they all come flying in from all directions to meet the boats.
Yeah. I think we had something like probably 3/4 an hour with them, didn't we? Before they started to get a little bit bored and started moving away. So yeah, they realised the fish had run out.
But yeah, the white pelican, we didn't get too many pictures of the white pelican. There's a much smaller colony of those on the lake. I think they're more sort of African and up into the Danube Delta. But you can just about see from that picture, they've got a sort of pink, fleshy area around the eye, and that's, at this time of year, that's the main difference, because they're not in the sort of full breeding plumage at this time. they seem to be mostly mature in the winter, and a lot of people go have a late visit to photograph them in the snow and the ice. Apparently that's the thing to do. It's one of those places to visit in the winter, just to see the pelicans.
So Keith's got all the kit for bird photography, all my kits for macro. So all the photos really of birds are very much Keith's work. Just amazing, some of the shots that he managed to get. So I'm just going to go through the slides really and just sort of give you a flavour of the birds, some of the insects, and then we'll start looking at some of the butterflies that we encountered as well. So things like penduline tit seem to be actually quite common. Once we got our eye in and started spotting the nests and stuff like that, we managed to pick them up quite easily. And again, we weren't out there with any guides. We went on our own. We did our own research, looked at previous reports on, I think Green Wings do their reports and stuff like that, which helps if you're visiting on your own to sort of pick some locations and think about the sort of species you need to be looking out for. And penduline tit was certainly a first for me. I'd never seen one before, and it was great to see them nesting.
Yeah, the boatman was a good source of information as well. He knew everything about the birds and where they were and nests and goodness knows what. So he was an interesting guy.
So some interesting species like spoonbill that they're starting to colonise in the UK, aren't they? I think they're getting breeding in the UK now in the south.
Yeah.
So it was nice to see spoonbill, but then things like black stork, chances of seeing one in the UK is pretty remote, I think.
Occasionally.
Some great shots of night heron just picking off some of the small fry and stuff around fishing nets. A real mix of sort of these sort of farmland type birds, especially crested lark was nice to see, and we did manage to find some of the nests, and I think it's in caves, isn't it? The nest at the rock nuthatch.
Yeah.
So real good, you know, if you're interested in birds and stuff, again, Lake Kirkini is just superb for bird life, absolutely superb. And again, we're not showing all the species. There's so many more species that we could have shown. We've got so many more photos that we could have shared. We just don't have the time really. But we did encounter lots of other species as well. Tortoise, we'd stumble across those quite regularly. Obviously, being a wetland area, there's lots of frogs. Occasional gecko. We weren't sure whether this was a wild cat or not, but it looked pretty wild to us. Had a very ringed tail, didn't it? So
yeah, I was happily convinced.
Yeah, and things like praying mantis as well. Once you get your eye in, quite easy to spot. And then the lizards as well, fantastic. Not everybody likes the large, scary spiders, and I know Heather's not keen, but she just literally walked under this spider, and it was only after she walked under it that I noticed it was just precariously hanging just above her head, which is why I took the photograph. But this was an absolute monster, so there's some pretty scary things out there.
She's just hiding under the kitchen table.
And you also took an LED moth trap out with you, didn't you, Keith? Which is the first time I'd seen it. It was a fantastic bit of kit.
Yeah, we didn't take a trap as such. We just took a sheet, which in the end we didn't need because the walls of the villa were white. And we literally just hung it on the balcony at night and left it on, and went out in the morning to see what we'd got. And this was definitely a good prize for us, the mole cricket. We certainly weren't expecting that, and it's massive. It's a fantastic creature. Yeah,
huge thing. So again, a great place for dragonflies is the really rare blade tail, which is the one top centre, which I think a lot of people just go to Lake Kirkini. And if I recall, we were on the boat on the lake, and another boat went past with some German tourists on, and they were asking us about this specific dragonfly.
Yeah.
They were very keen to find it. So
they actually, yeah, they were the only other naturalists we saw. They were two German guys, and they had cycled from Germany to as a holiday to see this dragonfly.
So that's keen.
That's good. They like cycling as well, obviously.
Yeah. So some of the moths that came to the trap, we had quite a lot of moths that came not to the trap, to the LED lure that Keith had got. But also during the day, we would find day flying moths as well. So there's quite a lot of species to keep an eye out for. And some of these were absolutely tiny as well.
That's a cracker, that is. A micro.
So really good mix of moths to keep an eye out. And then obviously the main reason, well, certainly the main reason I was there was the butterflies, just the sheer number of species that you're likely to see. I've not been able to find my spreadsheet, but I would say we were getting close to about 90 odd species of butterfly, Keith. Was it something like that? Or was it more than that?
Yes, I don't. Yes, no, you've caught me out there. Yeah, it was certainly, we're well on the way to 100.
Yeah. So just wanted to show a few species that once occurred in the UK that we saw around Lake Kokini. So black veined white, Camberwell beauty.
On the finger.
Sorry.
Well, we were talking earlier about butterflies on the finger, weren't we? And there we are.
Yes. Yeah. And these we actually struggled really to get photographs of Camberwell beauty, but I was driving the Jeep and regularly would say Camberwell beauty, but by the time we'd stopped and got out, nobody else believed that I'd seen a Camberwell beauty until finally we stopped and there was one still in the middle of the road. It landed in the middle of the road and I was proven right. So that was quite nice to actually get one that was willing to pose for us. So it was nice to see those. Large tortoise shells seem to actually be quite common, really. Once you got your eye in again, we seem to spot them in quite a few locations. In particular, one village, I can't remember what was the name of it. Was that Aclodockery? I think it was, wasn't it? Where we sat and had a drink under the lime trees, and there was a lot of butterflies being attracted to the lime trees that were in flower. And you could have easily missed them if you were just too busy focusing on your cup of coffee and not looked up. There's some great shots of large tortoiseshell. And large copper around the sort of marsh areas of the lake. Large copper seem to be in really good numbers. We saw quite a lot, and they're all really fresh and in good condition as well. So these are sort of the species that we used to have in the UK, but no longer. But I think the thing that really stood out for us was the sheer number of butterflies that we saw, particularly the nettle tree, which seemed to be absolutely everywhere. But particularly where there was damp areas of gravel on roads and tracks and that type of thing, they seem to congregate. And I just got a couple of video clips just to sort of give you an idea of the sort of numbers of butterflies that were around. So this was mostly nettle tree, but occasionally there'd be things like silverwash fritillary, or a large tortoiseshell would fly in and land. And this one as well, so it just gives you an idea. So it's just a really, really good, amazing experience. And as you can see, sometimes you have to get down on your hands and knees or even on your belly to get the shot that you want in these situations. I just put these in because the nettle tree is just a fantastic butterfly in terms of its character, with its long pulps, I think they're called.
Pulps, is it? Yeah.
And also the colour variation as well. Some are very sort of orangey brown, and then others are much more darker brown, like this individual. I don't know whether that was a male-female thing, possibly. But also we found on some of the trees, the strawberry trees themselves, a lot of empty pupal cases as well. So I think these are nettle tree pupa. It would certainly explain the numbers that we were seeing. But it wasn't just nettle trees, like I say, there was other butterflies that would congregate and depend on the sort of habitat. So here we've got all these other species, but no nettle tree butterflies at all. So it just depended where we were as to what you'd get. And there'd be things like Balkan green vein white, Meleager's blue, small blue, common blue, probably Idis blue, what else? Mazarine blue. They'd all be sort of feeding together. Brown Argus, I think, if I've not already mentioned. So there's a real mix of species that would sometimes come together like this. And then we just sort of quick run through really just some of the species that we picked up. So things like Oriental marbled skipper, mallow skipper, large grizzled. Hopefully we've got the IDs correct. Saw quite a few scarce swallowtails, but not in the sort of numbers that I've seen when I've been to places like Spain, which was interesting. So whether the food plant's just not so widespread, I don't know.
No.
This is a nice male scarce swallowtail. The way you can tell is there's those tiny little black dots near the edge of the front of the forewings that define it as a male. Occasional European swallowtail, this one egg laying, you just see the egg being laid. Eastern Bath white. In the side. Eastern wood white, took a little while to identify these. I think it's to do with the antenna and the red markings on the tips of the antenna, if I recall correctly. Other species of wood white have white tips to the antenna. Things like marbled fritillary. We only had a couple of sightings of eastern knapweed fritillary, and that was in that meadow, which I showed earlier with all the flowers. The video of that meadow with all the flowers was the only place we saw eastern knapweed. Spotted fritillary seem to be everywhere in reasonable numbers. We believe this is an aberrant spotted fritillary. It's a bit of a strange markings to it. And then lesser spotted. Queen Spain. Now this is a nice photograph just to sort of show the size difference between the male and female southern white admiral. The male's actually considerably smaller than the female. And I've just got a little bit of a video here. This is a female southern white admiral doing this interesting, feeding on the salts of Debbie's hand whilst doing these wing flicks, and the male circling around. And as the male gets closer, the female does these rapid wing beats. Finding safflons. Freya's Purple Emperor. I mean, without Keith, I probably wouldn't have spotted this. He knew exactly where to look and found them within a few minutes, really, of going to the right location, and just a superb butterfly to spot.
On the edge of the, in the sallows at the edge of the lake.
And then cardinal, surprisingly, I think we saw one cardinal for the whole trip.
Yeah.
Real fresh one. So whether we were right at the early stages of its emergence, not sure, but That was the only one we saw. And similarly with Map, we only saw one of those as well, of the summer brood. And this one looks fairly fresh, but with a bit of wear on it. So at the time, I was sort of expecting to see more, but we didn't see any. So after that one. And Balkan marbled white was, we saw that in quite a lot of locations, which is nice to see.
Yeah, a lot more brown.
Things like Pearly Heath, this one's lacking any eye spots on its forewings, the underside of its forewings. I believe this is Northern Wall Brown, just because of the dark banding on the sort of forewings. Things like Woodland Ringlet. Lattice Brown was a species that I was really keen to see, and just really interesting behaviour, because it seemed to spend all of its time in the shade. It never seemed to come out and bask in the sun. It was always one that you'd see it flying down a sort of narrow sort of walkway between scrub, and it would disappear under the scrub, and you'd have to sort of scramble underneath and try and find where it's settled. They never seemed to be out in the sunshine. Lots of different greylings as well. And then fiery copper, lesser fiery copper. Sooty copper. So you get a real mix of species as well that you would maybe pick up in Spain or France, that are also right across into Greece. And then really lovely species like this Balkan copper. And turquoise blue, which is a real stunning, absolutely stunning blue butterfly. I think probably your favourite, Keith, was the little tiger blue.
Yes, that fabulous butterfly that is. Yeah.
Again, lots of hair streaks. Slow hair streak. I think blue spot we didn't see many of. That was a species that seemed to be quite limited in numbers, but we saw quite a few hair streaks, different species. And then Keith got the only photograph of, and I think, am I right in saying it's the Kolev's anomalous blue, Keith, or is that wrong? Because the two species are very similar, aren't they? So what did you have it down as originally?
Oh, you caught me out there. Right parts, I think. It's one we only noticed in the photograph. We didn't actually, I don't think we noticed it at the time, did we?
No.
We were going through the photographs and suddenly realised it was something different.
Well, it's a nice, lovely species to see, that one. And Maliga's blue was great, real great to see.
They're scalloped.
Yeah, really distinctive. So that was just a very, very quick sort of photographic tour of the butterflies of Lake Kokini and the sort of local area. But we've not included all of these species here that we saw. There's probably another handful that we saw as well that I've just not remembered. One thing that we did note while we were there was the painted ladies were in huge numbers and seemed to be migrating north. And at the time, I think in 2019, there was a good number of painted ladies in the UK. And so that sort of migration and movement was definitely happening in Greece as well. But like I say, it's an absolutely superb area to visit. So if you ever get the chance to visit northern Greece, we definitely recommend going to Lake Kokini, because it is absolutely superb and just a lovely place to visit. Some lovely villages, great places to eat and have meals and stuff, and it's really good value for money, easy to get to. So
incredibly friendly locals as well.
Yeah,
no problem going on your own.
Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I just noticed a couple of messages. Yeah, that's just for Jamie, so that's cool. So if anybody's got any questions, happily answer them, or if you've got any questions, feel free to email myself or Keith if you ever fancy going to Lake Kokini, because I'm sure we could help in terms of good places to visit. I think probably hand back to Mike, actually, if you've got anything to say.
He's in the dark.
He's in the dark.
As I've often kept in with branch meetings, but I think, yeah, great presentation, Steve and Keith. Only disappointed in one small fact, that I wasn't credited with more photographs.
Sorry about that.
Yes.
But no, seriously, great to see all that. It looks a great spot to visit. I suppose it's only left for me now to just say thank you to all the speakers, Keith, Steve and Jamie. And just, if anyone's got any final questions or points, please let us know. If people would like to see both this hybrid sort of AGM in the future as well as the personal meet, then please let us know. And I think then it's about wishing you a safe journey home. Oh no, we're already at home, aren't we?